Hey everyone, Chelsea here with Core Solutions Group. We're out to help law business owners from all over the US get in tune with their business so they can scale profitably. Statistically speaking, more than 90% of businesses fail within 10 years. And just because you make it to 10 years in one day doesn't mean that it's smooth sailing and massive profits from then on. I heard someone point out one time that business ownership is the only profession where the longer you stay, the more likely you are to fail. Now, I know this sounds discouraging, but that's the truth we face, and that's exactly the reason why we're here with you today. Through this video series, we are bringing you information straight from the 10 percenters themselves, live and in person. This series highlights conversations about what it takes to make the cut, not only the technical components, but the mindset that breeds success. Ever heard of the saying that what got you here won't get you there? In business, if we are to succeed, we have to be willing to evolve, or else we'll die on the vine. The individuals that you meet through this video series come on as guests with the heart of servitude and a willingness to share insight on what has set them apart from the masses. So, without further ado, our guest for today is Dan Sloan, owner of Vertical Vision. Dan, thank you so much for coming on today and being willing to share your story.
Thanks for having me here.
So to start off, Dan, share a little bit about your background in terms of how did you come into practicing law for yourself?
Sure. Well, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer when I started undergrad. And I knew it, in fact, I wanted to be an environmental lawyer. So I took the sort of classic, oh, you want to be a lawyer, so you better be a political science major. But I also began in chemistry. After organic chemistry, I blew that one off and picked up a philosophy major in addition to political science. Went on into law school at the University of Michigan, again, focused on environmental law. I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to represent nonprofit groups. I wanted to be on the side of right. This was back in the early 80s. I got to the end of law school and we were in the middle of a recession, and there were no jobs with nonprofits. There weren't even any jobs with AGs. What had happened was, because of the recession, lawyers with a lot more experience had dropped into all of these positions anywhere there was a paycheck. So my mentor, Joe Sachs, said, well, go to work for a big firm for 3 years, and then you'll have experience, the recession will be over, and you can get hired at one of these places. So I went to work for a big firm, McGuire Woods. It was big at the time. They had 76 lawyers, which was considered, one of the bigger in the country in '83. So I started there, and a number of things happened. One, my mentor had sort of missed thinking through what kind of environmental law I'd be doing if I went to a big firm. He had not anticipated that it would be what I largely at that time would have seen as black hat work. So I would have been simply trying to get people out of being responsible for what they did. So I didn't actually go into environmental law. I went into real estate. And I guess one of the early lessons I learned was that a legal career could be a lot like maybe sailing, because you had to tack a little this way and that way to get where you wanted to go. I started out in real estate, doing conventional large-scale real estate, big leases, big financing. But simultaneously, while I was working at that big firm, I started working on the stuff that I really wanted to do, almost as a side gig. So I started working on CERCLA issues. Nobody else was working on CERCLA in their environmental department. They had a big environmental department, but CERCLA was directly related to real estate issues. So I started doing CERCLA, and because it was a bet the company type of issue, it became really important. And one of the things I found out was, within a couple of years, I'd cleaned up more real estate than any of my colleagues had even begun to imagine impacting, going out into the nonprofit world and the rest of it. And so I added other things, RCRA work, things that were related to real estate, wetlands work, work with archaeological elements. And another lesson occurred that might interest people, which was some of that work wasn't stuff I would have sought out. It wasn't my dream job in seeking, for example, wetlands permits to impact wetlands. But I found that if I did them the way that I really thought about them, which was how could we enable economic development, but at the same time protect the environment? And I brought that attitude to them. I created solutions for my clients. And those solutions actually allowed their deals to go forward, but in a very positive way that worked well with the agencies. I never litigated. I developed a really good reputation for taking tough issues that normally people would have thought could only be resolved through litigation and coming up with ways of resolving them. And it's sort of, that was how I began. And I actually built my career on that base.
Okay. So that's really interesting. I like how, you know, when you started on your journey and you got into, so you knew you wanted to do law and you knew you wanted to do environmental law. Is that right?
That's right.
So, just curious, because I can tell in just the way that you speak and the way that your story goes, you have a larger purpose, which I think is very important. And something that's also easy to miss because, you know, kind of like you said, when you first started, whether it be a job or a business, you kind of take what you can get, right? Which may not have much purpose, but viewing it as kind of more or less a stepping stone and making sure that you're continually, you know, finding that bigger purpose is crucial. And I hear a lot of that in when you speak.
Well, I think that's a really wonderful and positive way of looking at it. The negative version is, you know, you pay dues and you do things that you don't like in order to get where you want. I certainly did that. I certainly ended up working on some things that I didn't want to work on. I did draw some bright lines that were dangerous at the time in a big firm. I did at one point say no to taking on trying to have the Endangered Species Act declared unconstitutional. And, you know, it was risky just to say, no, that's not me. And the way I told it to them was my heart wouldn't be in it. And I think the client deserves somebody whose heart is in this undertaking. And you've got a lot of other lawyers here that will be perfectly happy to do that. But there were a lot of times where you went, would this be my preferred practice? And the answer was no. But here's the thing I run into all the time with people who are starting out. They think there's some chance for them to leap into their preferred practice. And my experience is that almost never happens. You have to think about it much more strategically. Where do you want to go? How do you build the skills so that when you get there, you're valuable to people? So taking that strategic approach, it's possible that I could have built those skills, again, working in an attorney general's office. It wasn't unusual for people to spend, 10 years in an AG's office, rise to the point where they could then move that experience into someplace. But when I talk to friends over the years, there are compromises in those places too. There's stuff they didn't want. There are politics that impacted the things that they wanted. There was no perfect place out there. Yeah. I've just been incredibly fortunate to be able to, over the years, build toward the practices that I really wanted to have and keep going on there. There was a point where you did have that dark of the night test, and it came along probably in the late 80s. Yeah, around 88 or so. I had started doing land use work as well. The firm had come to me and said, we'll officially recognize your environmental work if you'll also agree to do land use work for us. And I said, sure, that sounded interesting. I really didn't have a background in it, but I love learning new things. And so I said, sure. Well, I got good at it, but what I particularly got good at was combining my environmental expertise with that. And so suddenly I found myself doing zoning cases for mega landfills. 5,000 ton a day landfills, and I did several of those, many of those, and also cogeneration facilities, so large scale electrical facilities. And one night I was confronted, I just successfully zoned a large scale facility in a county. This was a large scale landfill where I'd already zoned a large cogen factory, a cogen plant. And a woman stopped me and said, "How do you sleep at night?" And, I said, "Well,
Ouch.
ma'am, unless you go home and you don't turn on any lights and you're eating your garbage," because at that point in the 80s, there wasn't any real recycling, you expect all these services to be there. You just wanted them to be in somebody else's backyard. And I get that. I'm completely sympathetic. But my landfills are, are double lined and then double lined again with witness leachate facilities, which are far in excess of anything anybody in the state was doing before I started working on these. My power plants are cogen plants. They're far more efficient than the usual plants. And fact of the matter is, I sleep really well. Okay, but remember that philosophy degree. So, so I go home that night and say, okay, how much of that was she attacked, I defended? Now, what do I really believe? And I looked at it carefully, and I really didn't have a problem with working on those large scale facilities. I thought they were done much better because I was involved in them. They weren't my favorite thing to do. And I didn't like going into, literally school auditoriums of people who at one point buried me in effigy and, weren't really excited about my projects.
Mm-hmm.
And about that time, I had started work on some projects that used a different approach. And I simultaneously realized that what actually kept me awake at night was not those power plants and landfills. It was the subdivisions and the shopping centers that I was doing that ate up habitat. And I didn't see any way we were going to fix those. If there was something wrong with my power plant or my landfill, there was usually a black box we could put on the end of a pipe and we could fix it. But there wasn't any fixing the shopping centers and the subdivisions. So that's the point in my career that I really started working on. We didn't have the word sustainability for it yet. We called it working on green issues. And I'd started working with the folks who later became the U.S. Green Building Council and the folks who became the Congress for the New Urbanism. Congress for the New Urbanism focuses on pedestrian-oriented communities. The USGBC focused on green buildings. I became, when both of those organizations were actually created, I became their lawyer. So I adjusted my practice so that I really ended up focusing on sustainable development and ultimately resilient projects. And that night did have a big impact on me, but not in the way she thought it would.
That's really interesting. So I hear in your story, and I think it's so important, you talked about, and we have already discussed, paying your dues and maybe going into corporate and getting the street smart and the experience of it. But oftentimes people end up getting stuck there, right? Because they don't know when to move and they don't know when to shift and, when to say yes even and when to say no. And, I've heard in you just talking that you have this ability to kind of reflect and pivot based on what you find. And even, you spoke to having a mentor. So maybe talk about, when did you know that it was time to move or time to say yes or time to say no? And having a mentor in your life, how did that impact you in your career and decision making?
Yeah. Well, those are great questions. I've had lots of mentors, wonderful mentors all along, and they're incredibly valuable. Particularly in the way I did it, I had an unusual opportunity in that the big firm that I was at grew dramatically. I told you it was about 76 or so folks when I started. When I ultimately left, it was 1,100. And one of the flexibilities within that firm was they would let me build whatever practice I wanted. Their only bottom line was it had to make lots of money.
That's it. That's all.
And so, I made partner very early. And I was notorious, and I don't necessarily advertise this as a good thing to do. I love pioneering stuff. I love making new stuff. I love charting new ground. I love creating practices by combining things. And every time I would create something that might be wildly successful, and normally somebody would have dug in and maybe occupied that space for a long time, I got bored. And I'd hand that off to, youngest rising associates and say, here's an underground storage tank practice, or, here's that CERCLA practice. And, I'm off working on this other thing that I actually like chasing clients. I know for a lot of the folks who would be listening to you, this is some sort of bizarre thing to say, but I liked that, and I can't tell you how big a change that was from the day I started. On the day I started, I can remember one of my first reviews. Now, remember my background. I'd been representing Greenpeace in law school. I'd been working on anti-nuke stuff. I'd been doing all this sort of stuff. So I wake up one day and I'm going to go in and represent corporations. All I'd ever thought of is corporations were evil. It never even occurred to me. And, so now these are my clients. And one of the first reviews I got was something that went to the effect of, our clients think you're really smart. They're not sure that you like them. and they don't think that you understand their businesses very well. And, you stop and think about it. I've been doing nothing but going to college. I had really no clue what their businesses were. And that could have been a showstopper right there. But I just took it like everything else, which is, can you learn this? Is there something here that you can learn? And I doubled down. I am probably, I learn a lot from books. I really do. I always think of it like the scene from Matrix, where they download the program into their head. So whatever it is that I'm challenged to learn, I turn to books first. So I read lots of books on business, and a couple of wild things happened. One, I figured out it was an incredible tool, a tool for good or bad, but an incredible tool, very powerful, and that I could learn a lot from my clients who were really good at using that tool. But along the way, I also learned that my practice was better if I thought like a business person too. So in that effort to understand how my clients thought and what was important to them and how to talk to them and how to persuade some of them to become clients, I learned a lot about business, and I learned I liked it. I enjoyed it. And so I began to apply that. I applied it to how I thought about our customer experience. I sought out, folks like Tom Peters and, others that sort of were thinking aggressively about different ways of approaching business. And I used a lot of that in my practice. So it ended up being very beneficial. I ended up being somebody who had a reputation for being able to build practices, being able to build them from scratch, being able to hand them off. But I did. I'm not sure that some of the folks watching this wouldn't be better off sort of once they built something, actually occupying it and being the expert, for a while. Just wasn't my personality that I enjoyed that as much. Now, that being said, there were some things that I found that I really enjoyed that I began working on and have never given it up. I've just never approached it as something that I thought I would one day know everything there was to know about it. And in a lot of law, that's the way we think about it. There's one day that I'll know everything there is to know about trusts and estates, or I'll know everything there is to know about the current tax code. And I will be the best because I know all of that. There's none of my practices today in building new towns or launching, green businesses or things like that. It's impossible to know everything there is to know. So I think that in the end, I've gravitated toward things that I could be one of the best, but it's in part because I can absorb the unknown and not be intimidated by, yeah, we're going to go where lawyers haven't gone before. There's not going to be necessarily a template that you can pick up and say, oh, this is how you do it, and have that zone of comfort that you get when you really do buckle down and develop a full expertise. And you have that comfort of, I know my stuff backwards and forwards, and there's no chance of anything being wrong. I actually live in a world where it's different. It's not that there's a chance of things being wrong. It's just, it hasn't been done before. So what is right is still being defined in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I can say this with confidence just because I've dealt with so many business owners over my career, that right there is truly a rare mindset. Typically, people fear change, they fear innovation, and they don't move forward because of that. And so it's interesting to me, and I wanted to point it out that, I believe that is one of the things that in order to be a business owner that you really do need to embrace. And so we've got about 10 more minutes here. I want to touch on something that you kind of talked on already, which is the client experience. And so for our viewers that are not familiar with client experience and what it actually is, what your clients experience from the time they first see your ad, your piece of marketing material, your content, whatever it is, from when they pick up the phone, and how the other person on the other side of the phone sounds and talks to you and treats you, through the intake process, through the actual experience of getting the services, and even after services are completed. That entire timeline is what we refer to as the client experience. So Dan, tell us more about your client experience and how it came to be and what it involved.
Sure. A couple of things. One, as I say, I spent a lot of years thinking about the client experience and envying those firms that went out and hired, design professionals to really tailor that experience from the moment somebody came to their reception area through their interactions with people, to how they got their bills and those sorts of things. And I think that's a great approach. Wasn't necessarily in my budget when I opened my own firm to do it that way, but I'd read a lot about it and was thinking about it. Now, hold that thought for a moment and combine it with the thought that I think every lawyer ought to have to hire a lawyer sometime and go through the experience of dealing with a lawyer to really understand how hideous the client experience can be, how something that is so important in your life and you don't know what's going on. You've called and they haven't gotten back to you, or you get these bills that have these random numbers on them, and they seem impossibly high, and you don't really even understand how you are in relationship to the ultimate outcome of what you're working on. Yeah. So I think that both thinking about it as an experience to be designed, and understanding that unmitigated, it is a pretty brutal experience for a lot of things. Now, worse if it's something like criminal law, maybe not the same for every type of transaction and those sorts of things, but still along a spectrum of scary stuff and not a pleasant experience. And so I looked at things like the way engagement letters are written. So, well, let's take a step back. When you come to my firm, typically you've come to my firm through word of mouth, or because I've met you at a conference that I've targeted the type of clients that I typically want to work with. I go to conferences, we talk, they decide whether they like my approach. I decide whether I like them and I want to represent them. Some people come through the website. That's a very small percentage. I do no ads. That's not, in fact, the few times in my practice I've ever done ads, I only got clients that I didn't want.
And to speak to that, I think it's important that our viewers keep in mind that you have been in this space, this specific space, for a long time, and you've developed a reputation, so it's maybe not as necessary for you to take those steps because you're already.
That's a good point. And in my early days, I tried lots of different things. I put ads in magazines, and I learned a lot about those, because I would think most legal ads are ineffective. They try to give you a picture of their firm name and puff out their chest and say, we're important and really good at what we do. And that's about all you can get out of them. You can't get personality. You can't get an individual. And there are studies that show most hiring is of individuals, not firms. These big deals, yes, they'll hire firms, but most hiring is of individuals and their expertise. I've done all of those. And then in the early days, I was building, but I always approached those because even then I couldn't trace that many hires to those, but they were building reputation. And so I looked at each one of those ads, and each time I decided to sponsor something as, how is that building the reputation that I want to build in this area? What are the things I'm sponsoring? I never sponsored a golf tournament. That wasn't my target clients
Right.
there. And I didn't really think the community was focusing on things I did that way. What I did do that was very useful was I did pro bono work. I did pro bono work not just generically, but I did it in the spaces that I worked. So the work I did for the Congress for the New Urbanism, I mentioned I became their first lawyer. I would say during certain periods of my career, 50% of my work came from the people that I met through that organization, because it was an organization of the people who do this cutting edge, new urban communities, large scale communities all around the country. So back to the customer experience though, I've tried to think about it from the point of how they see me. My website is idiosyncratic. You're exactly right. You have to take everything I say at this point through that lens of 36 years of experience and being out there, and a reputation that I can draw on, and a knowledge of my client base that gives me permission to be more idiosyncratic than many lawyers can tolerate. So I spent my years wearing a tie. We're doing all the right sorts of things. I hated ties. It was not my natural personality, but I did it for many, couple of decades. I did that. But then I reached a point where even in a big firm, my clients were not the sort of folks that by that point were wearing ties themselves. And one of the things you have to be careful of as a lawyer, I think, is not appearing to your clients to think that you're better than they are.
Yes, that's huge.
So for me, mirroring behaviors, or even more idiosyncratic behaviors than some of them actually are successful. All of that has to be done with a knowledge of, when you walk into a different kind of board meeting, you better be aware of how you're dressing. We don't get to perform like the tech industry where, we can say, oh, I wear nothing but black turtlenecks, whether I'm appearing in Congress or not. You always have to be conscious of your appearance, and your clients want you to be able to modulate your appearance according to the setting that they're sending you in, and don't do something stupid in it. But in the client experience of interacting with me, I am now at a point in my career where, yes, I can wear a Hawaiian shirt, and they don't think less of me. In fact, because they hire me often for creativity, this is matching up the experience that they want. They want signs that I am more creative than somebody they might already have a relationship with. So part of that experience is showing more of my personality, showing more of this is who I am. That's why when you go to my site, you see that my title is Lawyer and Vision Walla, because that stimulates a conversation. What's a vision walla? And that allows us to talk about their dreams and what they want to do and how I might help them manifest those, how I might help them
Yes.
experience. So you get that from contact and from the beginning. I try to have a very friendly engagement letter. It's almost an oxymoron, but yes, a friendly engagement letter in which I back off on some of the things in classic engagement letters that are, over. You remember this, for many of these clients, this is the first work they see of yours.
Right.
And
Right.
how you're going to be interacting with other people on their behalf, a number of things. They are making a judgment based on your engagement letter and the beginning of that. And then pushing my clients to interact on video, helping them think of me as somebody who's interested in helping them save money. A number of things will happen in the course of our engagement. I work on real estate transactions. So I'm one of the few real estate attorneys that you could call and say, well, why don't you come look at my site? And I'd first say to you, well, I've already looked at your site on Google Earth. I've already done a street view. You can now take me around the site with your phone and just set it on video, live stream video, and you can show me what you want to show me. I don't have to go look at your site these days. And they may still decide they want the personal interaction, or they want to show me their region. But that move of saying you don't have to spend the money to do that helps put me in a different place in their mind as somebody who's really helping them make their deal work, but not spending their money unnecessarily. I try to do that as part of how we set our rates. We'll set flat rates for things that we know, okay, this is how much time we're going to need to spend on this, or this is the efforts. We won't on things that are open-ended. If we've got a zoning case and we've got a bunch of interactions with people, we can't set a flat rate. We'll set a budget. We'll work with the clients on that. These days, post 2008, clients are very, very budget sensitive. That's a huge difference from before. They are very, very budget sensitive, and it was one of the reasons why I opened my business, was because in the firm I was working with, the rates had gotten to the point where I couldn't do what I really wanted to do in the way I wanted to. I couldn't meet the clients on the terms that they needed to be met in order to do the kinds of projects that I really enjoy.
Okay, so let's talk about that then. Let's talk about kind of the vision you had when you first started your own firm and how that's evolved to become a reality for you.
Sure. Well, the vision that I had when I started the firm was that I would continue the sort of work that I'd been doing, but I'd be able to reclaim my role in it. Over time, with a big firm, you have to hand off more and more of your practice to associates, and I likened it to, in the type of work that I do, going out and telling people, I'm the best brain surgeon in the world. You really want me to do your brain surgery, and making that sale, convincing them. And then as they're rolling into the operating room saying, hi, well, you can't actually afford me to do your brain surgery, but here's my associate with a few years of experience, and I'll be supervising them, but they'll actually be doing your brain surgery. And I hated that sale. I couldn't stand it. So my vision was to be able to get closer to my clients directly, to be able to do the type of work I wanted to do, to be able to say no to the type of work I didn't want to do, but understand the privilege in that statement and how different it would be from some of the folks who are watching, who are, straight out of law school or a few years in their practice, and don't fall for the illusion that having your own firm means that you get to say no more often. My experience with colleagues is it's exactly the opposite. You, in fact, have to say yes much more often than you would have in another firm, because you need the money. You need to be able to eat. Your kids need to go to college, and it's actually harder. So a privilege that comes along, sometimes when you're doing this later in life, and you do have reputation, you do have some savings, you have those sorts of things, is at that point, some of that benefit of being able to say no does occur. And all of those things have played through. There have been things I didn't anticipate. I knew that I didn't want to be responsible for a lot of salaries, and I knew in a small firm I wasn't going to be able to afford the wonderful support that I'd had in a big firm. I miss my assistant dreadfully. I miss being able to walk down a hall and just grab an associate and fling them at whatever unexpected problem has come up. I miss those things. I have a virtual associate. He's in another city. I have a virtual assistant. She's several states away. I have a virtual accountant. I have no employees. My office manager is my golden retriever who's asleep behind me.
On the job.
On the job. He'll bark at anything that looks like it might disturb the business. My IT sucks. My billing is pretty bad so far. It's one of the reasons why I have an accountant now. Those things I kind of knew would be challenges. They're not surprises. That they just take a little while to figure out how you want to get your arms around them. I think the surprising thing to me when I set out on this journey was how easy actually it is these days to open your own firm with the support of the apps, with just the general technology. It's amazingly easy. The costs are relatively low. The overhead is light in relative terms. Again, that depends on your practice. It's true of mine, not necessarily true of all. Some of the decision points in that too. I had to overcome golden handcuffs. I made a lot more money before I opened my own practice. But part of making the decision to open my own practice was hiring somebody to help me look at the economics and making a realistic decision as to how much I needed. And I didn't need the money that I was making at that time. I set much more realistic targets as to what I needed to achieve in these years. I'll blow past those targets. I'm comfortable with that approach, but I'd highly recommend being sort of realistic about the numbers, particularly when you start, and again remembering that I had another privilege, which was I brought a lot of clients with me. When I went out, I wasn't starting cold. Starting cold is scary. It's different. It's a different struggle. I just had to convince people that I wasn't retiring. That yes, I was practicing exactly the same as I had before, and it's been a thrill. It's been I have really enjoyed it. I've been able to do things. I've been able to integrate other projects more into what I'm doing. I began writing novels. I'm able to write those novels, and now I don't have to worry, oh gosh, there's a point in the day where I need to be doing something to pitch my novel or to do something, but here I am sitting on firm time, and I feel awkward doing it. No, I have one boss to answer to, and it's pretty good. I do have a partner, but my partner is there to deal with one of the legitimate concerns that one has when you're going out. If you're going out on your own, I found it a little intimidating to think about those days when I would have some problem, some challenge, something that I wanted to talk to somebody about, and I was afraid I would feel beholden to calling friends who were practicing and said, hey, I've got this problem, and talking it through with them, and that before long I'd run up so much karmatic debt that I would feel bad. So I approached somebody who is a longtime friend, and we set up practice together, but they're pretty independent parts of our practice, and we each are there for each other for those middle of the night, hey, I'm really thinking about this and I need some help.
Yeah. So I recently had a conversation with another lawyer, in fact, and we were talking about partnerships and why lawyers in particular choose to enter into a partnership as opposed to other options that are out there, or even as opposed to being a solo practitioner. And one of the things that she mentioned that I can really appreciate is that a lot of attorneys will go out and find a partner because should something happen to you, a lot of their clients will say, well, if something happens to you, then what happens to my case? And so having the peace of mind that there is another professional in the firm that can, take the lead if something were to either happen, to you, or you were out, or whatever it may be. There's a peace of mind that happens there that they feel just more comfortable, going with
Yeah,
that firm.
that would be really clever. Wish I'd thought of it.
Yes.
David's practice is very different than mine.
Yeah.
He would be completely lost, as I would be if I tried to step into his. I think about it in more pragmatic terms, Chelsea. If I keel over dead tomorrow, David can help sort through with my wife how to help the clients figure out what's what and keep going. But that's about it.
Yeah. Well, at least something as opposed to nothing, I suppose. Yes.
But I certainly understand that, and I think my practice isn't that sort of the world won't pause. Most of the things I work on would probably pause, or I could work around. But you do highlight one of the challenges, because I do land use. For example, there are meeting dates that are set that may have really serious conflicts with other things that I'm supposed to do. I don't have anybody to cover for those. I have to sometimes make some hard decisions, and that part's a challenge in a solo or quasi solo practice of competing elements. Not so much somebody stepping in, but just, okay, I really need to do both of those things, and I can't.
Yes, being responsible for everything and everyone all the time. Yeah, I think, and you've talked about it a little bit before so far in terms of, making sure that you're going into practice for yourself for the right reasons and understanding what that means. And if that means less money, then adjusting, budget and being okay with that, and really weighing the options. And so,
but Chelsea, I don't want to mislead anybody. I still set milestones that are very large amounts of money.
Absolutely.
So it's a sort of make sure that you understand the survival version of what you're doing.
Yes.
And just as partnership and other things along the way, or milestones, they weren't live or die, I'm going to be a lesser person on the other side of this. These sort of economic milestones of, gee, I'd like to make this, like I have a milestone, which is I'd like to make more money in my current practice in any one year than I ever made in the big firm. That's one of my milestones. If I die having not achieved this milestone, I'll be okay. But it's still sort of one of the ways to challenge yourself through the year, and in putting together things, and just thinking through, if that were an actual milestone for me, how would I do that? What would I focus on, and how would I achieve it?
Yes. Yeah. And that's really important too. Consistently setting goals and making sure that you're working towards something, like we talked about, a bigger purpose. And I think that, as we wrap up here, some of the big takeaways that I think people can take from you being so generous with all of this information and everything that you've shared with us is that, having a passion and a purpose and something that you care about, even if it means doing some things to use as a stepping stone to get to where you really want to go, having something that really truly piques your interest and that you're not miserable showing up to work at every single day. And, also being flexible and following that passion and that interest, and knowing when to pivot, when to make the move, when to make the shift, when to say no, and when you need to say yes, even when you shouldn't. And, you also talked about, and I really love this, is looking for a lesson learned. Something's always going to happen. There's always going to be an unhappy client, or, a result that you weren't happy with. But instead of denying it or avoiding it, looking it in the face and saying, what lesson do I have to take from this? So I really, really appreciate your time today, Dan. Thank you so, so much for the opportunity to speak with you on all of this stuff. And in closing, what is the biggest piece of advice, or the most important or crucial piece of advice, in your opinion, that you can share with our viewers?
So when I was about to go to law school, I met with a judge who was one of the few people who was doing environmental work at that time. He had a lot of environmental cases, and I talked to him about what I was going to be doing, and he said, "Well, you should only go into." There are two sorts of people. There are people who do this because they have a passion for an outcome, or they would think it'll be a good place to make money. And you sound like somebody with a passion, so maybe you shouldn't do this. And I've always thought that advice was about as far from right as could be. I believe that it is quite possible for us to pursue our passions, to make good money while we do that. I think that the keys to that are being flexible, and understanding that achieving that passion may be aspirational. We may have to look for it in the future, but as long as we are making continued progress to having the skills to achieve it, we're going the right direction.
Absolutely. I always like to say that profits should be a byproduct of passion, for sure. So awesome. Well, thank you again so very much. I know that everyone's going to enjoy this. Everybody, you can always leave comments, ask Dan questions. We'll try to get him to answer them. I think he'd be willing. So thank you very much, Dan. We'll see you next time.
Take care.